When a German general saw America's railways running without pause, he realized the war wasn't being lost at the front, it was being lost in motion. Autumn of 1943. Europe was collapsing under the weight of total war. On the Eastern Front, German armies were being ground down mile by mile, man by man. In the skies above the Reich, Allied bombers arrived every night with mechanical certainty, ripping apart factories, rail yards, and entire cities. Germany was still fighting, still resisting, but beneath the surface, something far more dangerous than enemy fire was spreading. Exhaustion, not of soldiers, but of systems. And thousands of miles away from the battlefield, one German general was about to understand this truth with devastating clarity. General Wilhelm von Thoma was not a man of slogans or blind faith. He was a professional soldier, shaped by decades of warfare, a tank commander who understood that modern battles were not won by bravery alone. They were won by fuel, by transport, by the invisible arteries that kept armies alive. Captured in North Africa after the collapse of the Afrika Korps, von Thoma expected the familiar patterns of war captivity, harsh conditions, scarcity, deliberate humiliation. That was how Germany imagined POW camps operated. What he encountered in the United States was something entirely different and far more unsettling. The journey itself was the first shock. As his transport train moved inland from the American coast, von Thoma watched through the window with the eyes of a planner, not a prisoner. He saw rail lines everywhere, not damaged, not patched together, perfectly maintained, multiple tracks running side by side, stretching across open land as far as the eye could see, switching yards alive with movement, freight cars being assembled, disassembled, rerouted with quiet efficiency. This was not wartime desperation. This was control. In Germany, railways had become a battlefield. Bombed tracks, destroyed locomotives, fuel shortages, constant improvisation. Entire offensives had stalled because trains could not reach the front. Von Thoma had lived that reality. He had watched armored units immobilized not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. He had seen commanders argue over rail priority while battles were lost waiting for supplies that never arrived. Now, here in America, he was seeing the opposite of collapse. He was seeing motion without interruption. Everywhere the train passed, there was evidence of scale. Coal trains feeding power plants, tank cars carrying fuel, endless strings of boxcars filled with machinery, food, ammunition. These trains did not creep forward cautiously. They moved with confidence on schedules that assumed nothing would stop them. And nothing did. There were no bomb craters here, no emergency repairs, no frantic rerouting. The system was intact, protected by distance, geography, and overwhelming capacity. At the POW camp, the pattern continued. Supplies arrived on time, food was plentiful and consistent, medical care was organized, guards rotated smoothly, even recreational materials were delivered with regularity. To the average prisoner, this was comfort. To von Thoma, it was evidence. Nothing here felt temporary, nothing felt improvised. This was not a nation straining under the weight of war. This was a nation that had planned for it. Von Thoma was allowed to read newspapers, and he read them like intelligence reports. He ignored the headlines and studied the margins, shipping statistics, production figures, casual mentions of new rail expansions, new fuel pipelines, new factories coming online. The numbers were staggering. Germany could destroy rail lines faster than it could repair them. America could lose rail capacity and replace it without slowing down. Germany fought for access to fuel. America moved fuel as a matter of routine. The realization did not arrive suddenly. It crept in, train by train, statistic by statistic. One afternoon, von Thoma stood near the camp perimeter and watched a freight train pass. Car after car rolled by, loaded with steel, vehicles, fuel drums, boxed machinery. He counted out of habit and stopped. The train was too long, and before the last car vanished, another train appeared on the adjacent track, moving just as steadily, just as full. In that moment, the war became clear. This was not about who had better soldiers. It was not about who had smarter generals. It was about who could sustain effort indefinitely. Germany had built its strategy on speed and shock, on winning quickly before resources ran out. America had built a system designed to function year after year, no matter the cost. And in a global war, endurance was everything. Von Thoma understood now that Germany's fate had been sealed long before the landings in Normandy, long before American tanks rolled through France. A nation that could not protect its railways could not protect its armies. A nation that rationed fuel could not fight mechanized war forever. A nation whose factories burned nightly could not outproduce an enemy whose factories never slept. In captivity, far from gunfire and explosions, the truth was unavoidable. Germany was not losing because its soldiers lacked courage. It was losing because its systems were collapsing faster than they could be repaired. And America's systems were accelerating. The war, von Thoma realized, was already over. As the months passed, captivity gave General Wilhelm von Thoma something the front lines never allowed: time. Time to think, time to observe, and time to accept conclusions that, in Germany, would have been considered defeatist, even treasonous. Inside the American POW system, von Thoma was not interrogated harshly, nor was he isolated. Instead, he was surrounded by evidence that spoke quietly, relentlessly, and with far more authority than any speech from Berlin. He began to notice how the American war effort reached far beyond the military. Railways did not serve only tanks and ammunition. They fed cities. They powered factories. They connected farms to ports and ports to oceans. Everything moved, and everything depended on movement. This was total war, executed with total organization. In Germany, total war meant desperation. In America, it meant coordination. Von Thoma compared what he saw to what he remembered. In late 1942 and early 1943, German rail schedules had become works of fiction. Trains were planned, then canceled. Supplies were promised, then diverted. Fuel trains were rerouted under bombing pressure, often arriving too late to matter. Armored divisions sat idle, engines silent, waiting for gasoline that never came. Even victories felt hollow because there was no certainty they could be sustained. America, by contrast, operated on assumptions Germany could no longer afford. Trains assumed tracks would exist tomorrow. Factories assumed power would remain on. Ports assumed rail cars would arrive exactly when needed. And those assumptions were correct. That was the terrifying part. The American system did not react to crises, it absorbed them. At night, von Thoma listened to the distant sound of trains passing beyond the camp. The rhythm was constant, predictable. There was no sense of emergency in that sound, no urgency, just continuity. In Germany, night meant air raid sirens, fires, and shattered rail yards. Here, night meant freight schedules continuing uninterrupted. The contrast was impossible to ignore. He also noticed how little strain the war placed on civilian life. American towns near the camps were intact, shops were stocked, fuel flowed, electricity stayed on. This was not a population being slowly bled dry by conflict. This was a society that had integrated war into daily life without allowing it to dominate or destroy it. For von Thoma, this was perhaps the most sobering realization of all. Germany had mobilized everything and still fallen short. America had mobilized intelligently and barely seemed inconvenienced. The conclusion followed naturally. Even if Germany somehow stabilized its fronts, even if it slowed Allied advances, even if it inflicted enormous losses, it could not change the underlying equation. Time favored America, production favored America, logistics favored America, and logistics, von Thoma knew, was destiny. He recalled conversations from before the war when German planners dismissed the United States as unprepared, decadent, incapable of sustained military effort. They had believed America lacked discipline, that its industry was inefficient, that its society was too soft for prolonged conflict. Sitting in an American POW camp, watching supplies arrive like clockwork, von Thoma understood how catastrophically wrong those assumptions had been. America's strength was not speed, it was depth. Depth of resources, depth of infrastructure, depth of redundancy. If one rail line failed, another replaced it. If one port was congested, another absorbed the load. Germany had built a system optimized for quick victories. America had built a system optimized for inevitability. By 1944, when news of Allied landings in France reached the camp, von Thoma felt no surprise, only confirmation. He imagined the supply lines stretching behind those armies, fuel depots fed by ports, ports fed by rail, rail fed by factories, factories fed by raw materials arriving from across the world. This was not an invasion force, it was an extension of a global machine. In Germany, the invasion was described as a challenge that could still be overcome. Von Thoma knew better. You do not defeat an enemy whose logistics grow stronger the farther they advance. You do not outfight an opponent whose rear areas are more powerful than your front lines. Normandy was not the beginning of defeat. It was merely the moment defeat became visible. As the war drew closer to its end, von Thoma stopped asking questions. He already had the answers. When reports of fuel shortages paralyzing German units reached the camp, he was not shocked. When news arrived of rail hubs destroyed beyond repair, he understood the implications instantly. Armies without fuel are crowds, tanks without gasoline are monuments, and generals without supply lines command nothing. After the surrender in 1945, von Thoma, like many German officers, returned to a country in ruins. Railways shattered, cities flattened, industry crippled. The system that had failed during the war had collapsed afterward. And yet, the lesson he had learned in America remained with him. Germany's future would not be decided by speeches or symbols. It would be decided by rebuilding infrastructure, restoring logistics, and reconnecting the arteries of the nation. Years later, when historians analyzed why Germany lost the war, they often pointed to battles, to strategic mistakes, to ideological blindness. Von Thoma knew those factors mattered, but he also knew they were secondary. The true defeat had occurred silently, long before the final surrender. It had occurred when Germany lost the ability to move. War, he understood, is movement. Movement of men, movement of fuel, movement of food, movement of ideas and machines. When movement stops, war ends, no matter how fiercely soldiers fight. In America, von Thoma saw a nation that never stopped moving, a nation whose trains ran not toward desperation, but toward certainty. And that was why long before Berlin fell, long before the last battles were fought, one German general had already accepted the inevitable. The war had been decided on the rails, and Germany had lost it.